that bio is the study of life, but now we need to know what actually is life. What does it mean to be alive? What are the characteristics of life itself? So, in today's video, we're going to talk about those characteristics. So, the first one that all living things have in common, and I mentioned this, I think, in the first video, is all living things are composed of cells. So, all living things are composed of cells. So, in a multicellular organism, many cells are specialized to perform specific functions. So, heart cells have a specific job to do. Bone cells have their specific job to do. Kidney cells, brain cells, all those have their, even though they're cells, they always have their own specific jobs to do. So a bone cell can't do what a heart cell does, and a heart cell can't do what a bone cell does. Well, you might say that, well, a heart cell is just basically a muscle cell, and you're right. The heart is a big muscle, but you have skeletal muscles, cardiac muscles, and smooth muscles. The smooth muscles are the muscles that are around your internal organs. The cardiac muscle are muscles that are around your heart, and skeletal muscles are muscles that attach to your skeleton. So a skeletal muscle could not work a cardiac muscle, so it could not be in the same place. If you had smooth muscles where your skeletal muscles go, you wouldn't have any control of them. So everything in our body is specialized, has its own particular job, has its own particular category. Also, another thing that we need to mention that I think I've mentioned before, cells are always very, very tiny. They have a small ratio of volume to surface area, and that is very important. And the size of these multi-celled organisms, like elephants or dogs, cats, goats, humans, the size of those organisms depend on the number of cells, not the size. So since an elephant is so big, it doesn't have big cells. Since a mouse is so tiny, it doesn't have super tiny cells. Everything has the same size cells. There's just more of them. So an elephant would have the same size cells that I have, just a lot more. I would have the same size cell that a mouse has, just a lot more. So, organization. So, cells are organized at both, well, I shouldn't say cells, organisms are organized at both the molecular and the cellular level. So, living things take in substances from the environment and organize them in complex ways. So, for example, we humans take in oxygen for air and glucose as fuel. But how we handle those things once they're in the body is different depending on, if you're a plant or an animal. What do you do with those compounds once they get into your body? And the things that handle these compounds, the thing that breaks them down, are these organelles. And organelles, those are the things that are inside the cell. So these guys here, organelles. These are little units that actually live inside of the cells. So this is a scale model. It goes from smallest, this is an atom, 0.1 nanometers. That is tiny. That's a millionth of a meter. So that's super, super, super tiny. This is a molecule, and that's 10 times as big. Then you go up. This is a chloroplast. G is a chloroplast. E is a virus, and that's super small. These are chains of protein. This is a cell, plant cell. This is a fly. You know what that is? 1 centimeter. This is a mouse. Right there. A human, 1 meter. And then a whale is a little over 10 meters. So this is the scale of things. And we as humans, with the naked eye, we can see from this line down. So a millimeter upward. So a millimeter up this way. That's what we can see with our naked eye. But down this way, we're going to need some extra help. We need microscopes and stuff to see the tiny stuff. You have light microscopes and then scanning electron microscopes to see everything this way. So in multicellular organisms, that's anything with more than one cell. So a dog, a cat, a monkey, a chimpanzee, things are organized by their function. So at the basic, the bottom level, you had cells, right here, cells. So a group of cells, they group themselves into tissues. So a group of certain cells, so a group of heart cells, they lump together, and that is cardiac tissue. Okay, a bunch of cardiac tissue lumped together, and you have an organ, which in this system would be the heart. Okay, the heart works with other systems, veins and arteries, and the lungs, and you have systems. So the cardiovascular system. Okay, the systems come together, the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, the lymphatic system, the endocrine system, the urinary system, the reproductive system, the integumentary system, the skeletal system, and the muscular system. I think I got them all. Reproductive system. I think that's all of them. But all those come together, all those systems come together, and that's how you get a complete organism. So all those things work together. An organism is at the top of the hierarchy. So cells into tissues, tissues into organs, organs into organ systems, and then all those organ systems into the complete organism. So energy use, that's another characteristic of living things. All living things use energy in a process called metabolism. The metabolism is just the sum of all chemical reactions. And this, I showed you this before, this is just the equation for photosynthesis. And we'll get into this equation more when we talk about photosynthesis. This is just an overview of what it is. And we'll talk about that more. Homeostasis, another characteristic of living things. Homeo, and we talked about this the last slide, I believe. And the example was the diabetic. So homeostasis is just maintaining your internal conditions. So whether it be temperature, whether it be pH, whether it be glucose levels, your body has a certain stable condition that it wants to have met 24/7. The next characteristic of all living things is growth. So growth occurs as a result of cell division. And that's another fancy word is mitosis, and we'll talk about that later on uh, this year. So mitosis is when the cell divides. So the cells in your body kind of reproduce like bacteria does. Bacteria, one bacteria just boop divides into two, and that's how the cells in our body divide. They get big, they divide in two, then they enlarge, and they divide in two again. So they just continue to grow. So cell division is the formation of two cells from a pre-existing cell. So you have one cell, it breaks in two, now you have two cells. And those two cells, they grow, they break in two, now you have four cells. This is exactly how a zygote forms. So you have the two eggs, the mom's egg, the dad's sperm meet, then those cells just continually divide. 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, 16 to 32. Then you have a blastocyte, and then et cetera, et cetera. As cells grow, they enlarge and they mature. So once again, once they get to a certain size, they divide and cleave in two. So it's just a continual process. It's just a continuous cycle. And that cycle is known as the cell cycle. So that's the process of making new cells. So a point I need to add in there, the cell knows it's getting big enough when its surface area isn't big enough for its volume. Because it wants that surface area to volume ratio to be very low. So the inside gets big, but the surface area, the area around it, is not big enough. So that's when the cell starts to divide in two. So a cell can only be functioning, it can only be efficient enough at a certain size. Once it exceeds that size, it's time to cleave apart and to form two new smaller cells. Another characteristic shared by all living things is development. So this is a process by which an adult grows from a little one. So you grew from your baby to your adult state, and that you developed over time. That is called development. And it happens with all these cell cycles, all these times that the cell divides, all this of development. So the older you get, the more cell divisions you've been through, the more time your DNA has been copied, the more times that you've had certain proteins made, the more time your body's shedded skin cells, the more time. So over time, your body replenishes itself. So another characteristic is reproduction. So all living species have the ability to reproduce. So it's not, the ability to reproduce is not essential for the individual, but it's essential for the continuation of a species. So for example, a donkey and a horse, they both can reproduce. Okay? But if you made a horse with a donkey, you get a mule. That mule cannot reproduce on its own. So a mule and a mule cannot have baby mules. So that species can't continue on its own. So you constantly need a horse and a donkey to mate to get that mule. So, and a definition of species is being able to reproduce on your own. So a mule is a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. It's not a species in and of itself. Another characteristic is responsiveness. So that's just how you respond to the stimulus in your environment. So plants respond to sunlight by growing toward the light. Plants don't just grow up to grow up. They grow that way because that's the direction that the light is coming from. They grow up. Um, when you give rotifers, which are a small organism, when you infuse caffeine into the water that they're swimming in, you can see them change their behavior, and that's just their response to stimulus. When you go from a dark room to a well lit room, your pupils shrink, and vice versa. When you go from a lit room to a dark room, your pupils enlarge, and that is your body's response to stimulus. Also, you have the fight or flight response. That's also a response to your stimulus. So anything living will respond to their own, to external things. All right, evolve or evolution. Um, all organisms have the ability to adapt to their environment, and this is a process called evolution. Like we talked about earlier, it's just small, gradual changes over time. The most favorable characteristics, those are the ones that are selected and passed to the offspring. And when I say favorable, that just means the ones that allow them to survive their environment and pass those traits on to their offspring. These favorable traits are called adaptations. So if someone can adapt to their environment, that means they can live in the environment more successfully than anyone else. So those are adaptations, and that increases the organism's fitness. So all this is driven by natural selection. We talked about that last lecture, or survival of the fittest, and that is a phrase coined by Charles Darwin, and we'll talk about him in more detail when we get to the evolution section. So today we learned the characteristics of all living things. Okay, and they're 9 characteristics. So let's sum those up. So a quick way to remember this is kind of like a mnemonic device. So what I like to think of is chore, chore, gram. So kind of break it into 2 words. So chore and then gram. So each one of these letters stands for something. So all living things have cells. All living things go through homeostasis, which I have spelled wrong. Better. All living things are organized. All living things reproduce. All living things need energy. Okay, so you have your chore. Now your gram. All living things grow. All living things respond to stimulus. Stimuli. Stimuli is more than one stimulus. All living things adapt or evolve. I use the word adapt because it fits my little thing. And then all living things move. So all living things move in one way or another. So those are the 9 characteristics that you need to know. Cells, homeostasis, organized, reproduce, energy. They grow, they respond, they adapt, evolve, and they have movement. All right. Even though you can't physically see plants move, I mean they don't get up and run around. They move as they grow, or they grow around a log, or they grow tendrils that wrap around other branches or fences or stuff like that. So pick up any object, go through this checklist. if they don't have all 9 of these characteristics, then whatever you're holding is not a living thing. All right, you could add water to a sponge and it looks like it grows, right? But if you poke it with a pen, does it respond to your stimuli? Does that sponge, that kitchen sponge, does it reproduce? Does it evolve? Does it adapt to the environment? Does it have cells? If you put it in an oven, does it respond? Does it try to maintain an internal balance with homeostasis? So if you have a living thing, it will have all of these 9 characteristics. All right. Next lecture, we'll go over the scientific method. All right. See you then.